lighting. Very front ones off, so it should be fine. You never know. Sound working?
Test run on sound. Test run on sound.
They will not respond to such a.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Yours event. We've got two more after this, one next week and one the week after, and then we have a break, Christmas. But the latest in this series of talks this term is by Simon Baker. And I've known Simon for a little while, although we just met for the first time, but our paths have kind of crossed in the sense that the Experts book I edited a few years ago now had a chapter in it by Simon with Brett Lashua. And Brett, some of you do know, he's the external examiner on this on the CHM course, and he also gave a Yours seminar a couple of years ago. So this was originally set up as a double act. Brett was going to come too, because Simon and Brett have worked together on a number of things.
We're drinking partners.
And very important. But Brett is in the Netherlands at the moment on a I don't know what he's on in the Netherlands, but he's in the Netherlands anyway, so he wasn't available. So great pleasure to welcome Simon. And Simon represents an architecture firm, Group Ginger, based in Leeds. And I specifically asked Simon whether he could talk about some of the projects and some of the ways in which the work that he does and design and creativity within his work as an architect crosses over with some of the heritage issues that he's encountered. Heritage as constraint, heritage as opportunity, and so forth. So we're going to get, I think, a range of ideas and case studies and examples that cover that broad area. You did have a title, and I can't remember the title. And
I think we were backgrounding architecture and heritage, foregrounding activity.
Correct. Excellent. Simon, over to you.
Hello. No, I'm happy for people to interrupt. Don't feel that you should be nervous about my flow. You can, if there's a burning question or I annoy you in some way, you can interrupt or seek clarification. That's generally how we tend to work, is through conversation. So I'll tend to put out thoughts and statements, and then other people react, which is probably why we get on quite well with Brett, in a sense that we provoke each other into a conversation and never really quite know where that conversation is going to go or how it might manifest itself. So Group Ginger is the practice, and I'll explain why Group Ginger at the end after the presentation. But generally, if there's a consistency throughout when we start projects, it's to destroy the norm. It's to look at the kind of situationist philosophy, and to look at how we might question the status quo, sort of the current thoughts about how you should do something, and then seek to challenge that and find other ways of doing it. That doesn't mean we don't always do kind of unconventional work. It just means that we start with that, we posit a question at the beginning rather than just actually following that. And it might be that actually the convention is the best way of moving forward, in which case that's what we do. But the reason we seek to kind of question the norm is because I think really we are consciously aware all of the time of this idea of kind of McDonaldization, a kind of rationalization of our world into a predictable domain, so that gives people surety and certainty, and off the back of that certainty they can base a business plan, and there's a kind of reliance on it. And so the term kind of McDonaldization comes from kind of places with high degrees of rationalization, which produce islands of the living dead. So
we must not be lulled by the concept that these are our family members or our friends. They are not. They will not respond to such emotions.
Operator dead. Close to bed. It's everywhere. What the hell is it? Looks like a shopping center. One of those big indoor malls.
What are they doing? Why do they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory, what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives.
So we're really, that's everything that we, actually the zombies are pretty good, but we're against the idea of over-controlled, sterile places where people's behaviour becomes so predictable that you can basically do a spreadsheet of numbers on it and work out how much money you're going to make. And what we're looking for isn't that kind of inauthentic leisure experience. We look at how we can develop our spaces so that the participants in those spaces become active and engaged rather than unengaged beings. And so and that's how we approach all of our projects, is about looking at people, looking at what the activity is. So in terms of looking at a project, this is about looking at Scarborough Market, which is a grade 2 listed purpose-built market hall, which is certainly not inauthentic, but when we came to it, it was unloved. It was kind of lost. It wasn't over-controlled or rational, but it had been abandoned to its own fate. So there's a kind of subtlety here about something being over-rationalized and over-controlled and then actually being freely abandoned. And so actually, to sort of quote Schumi, to kind of bring life to architecture, you may have to bring love into architecture. And so we in terms of Scarborough Market, this was, well, how can we bring a degree of rationalized space, a degree of care and attention back into that space, a level of respect to the original building that would bring that love back into it and bring people back into it to bring activity, on the basis that without activity and action and event, that there isn't an architecture, or that architecture has no meaning. So our proposal really was to sort of try and clean it up. So you've got the remains of the existing market hall, and then we put in the new mezzanine arrangement and opened up the stalls to the foreground, so that there was good visibility across the hall. And I think actually we picked up on different schemes that there had been previously, where there'd been a much more, for want of a better word, avant-garde approach or contemporary approach to the new stalls. And we played around with a sort of a familiar architecture, so that or something that was in keeping with the market hall, so that it didn't alienate people. There was a sense of the familiar when they came into that space. So, and as finished, the listed building is still dominant. We've kind of edited out and stripped back all of the kind of detritus that was detracting from that, to become conscious of the kind of the volume of the space and create a stage, a kind of celebrating the theatre of the retail market, and create a stage for the actors, which is the traders who have been there for, I mean, they haven't been there for hundreds of years, but their families have been there for hundreds of years. And so we worked with what became known as the famous five, which was the 5 traders whose families had been in the market hall, running fruit and veg and butchers markets for over 100 of years. And it was about putting them and the produce centre stage, and actually really celebrating those. So a sort of a kind of quite a non-architectural approach, in a sense, that this was about people and produce rather than the objects that we were then putting in. And really about sort of celebrating people, Mr. Knuckles, the butcher, but then also bringing other uses in that could add a level of kind of dynamic to those space, and a kind of mix of uses. And in terms of that kind of that richness and intensification of activity, bringing life back. This is actually theatre productions and bands that have then started to come in and start to make use of the space. So when we did the proposals, this is a little bleached, I'm sorry, but actually we left a large part of the market hall open that would have temporary stalls in that could be cleared away so that they could use it then for performances and events.
So this building has been here for the best part of 150 years as a marketplace for Scarborough. This essentially at one point was the centre of the town. The market in Scarborough started originally at Scarborough Castle, which was the first settlement in the town. And then in the following years, it moved down to the seafront in and around the harbour. And we had what's called Scarborough Fair, which is a very famous festival that used to happen once a year for several weeks, where everybody came, bought and sold and exchanged goods and got thoroughly drunk and had a cracking time. And then by royal charter, the market was, this site was cleared and the market was established here some 150 plus years ago.
Looks a bit empty, actually. And then once a month now, this is the market again. There's there are real characters that get to come and enjoy the market, and so that's actually, we joke about this, but this was actually a really serious thing. We couldn't predict how this was going to work, but it was really successful, and there's a whole new audience to the market that's actually benefiting trade. And the traders are actually starting to work together so that they're actually looking forward and engaging with the city and its events programme and other activities that are going across in Scarborough. So if there's a Northern Soul Festival, then the temporary market is setting up to be selling vinyl and clothing, and it's a win-win situation, which couldn't have been predicted at the beginning. Well, you might say it was, but without a sort of degree of certainty. So it's kind of hugely successful. Now, I mean, so within that context, and a much larger scale project. Now, I put this in because actually this is to a degree is a failure. If Scarborough Market was a sort of huge success, then this, to a degree, well, not to a degree, it is a failure. So we're in Lichfield, which is a kind of medieval town, and the site is, this is actually the line of the old Friars Ditch. So this was never developed as part of the medieval town, and then successive growth of the town out towards the railway has then sort of filled this in with a bus station, police station, multi-storey car park, and council offices and garage. And we were asked to start to look at a kind of an extension of that town centre and add more retail. And actually we, to a degree, conformed to the model of singular use buildings. So you've got retail, you've got a multi-storey car park, you've got residential, cinema over the top, and car parking underneath. And ostensibly, it's a single-use retail model, pretty traditional. You kind of recognise it. A shopping street which isn't covered. And we did our bit of kind of looking at how we kind of break down the massing and looking at articulating the new shopping street with different architectural forms to tie in with the kind of the pattern, grain, and urban scale of Lichfield, so creating a new high street, and then looking at how we could create what we felt was a sort of this is a Grade 1 listed arms house, so we're in a conservation area. So to a degree of sensitivity, how we then dealt with the kind of the edges of that, and kind of respect the context and knit it in with kind of new spaces and new key landmark buildings. But actually, this has failed. This isn't going ahead, and one of the reasons it's not going ahead is because the sheer scale of it, the intervention into the place, and the reliance on an old model to secure the funding. So actually this scheme has stopped. It's not going forward. It's kind of quite interesting for us because actually I think it was probably the one project that sat most at odds with our portfolio. So it's kind of forced us to sort of question a little bit as to where we are. But it also highlights, I think, this idea of things being a bit more mixed up. That, you know, if the antidote to the zombie city is a kind of a dense city of adventure, where you can encounter the unfamiliar and the confusing. So the Lichfield project previously, what wasn't actually unfamiliar or confusing. It was actually quite predictable and a reinforcement of an established model. And really, what we're much more interested in is kind of unruly, overcrowded city. And I love this quote of kind of glittering, cosmopolitan, confusing, dangerous, seductive, wild, loud, streaming, blurred, sharp, shrill, soft, lost, ice cold and overheated metropolis of modernity, a city of peril and promise. And actually, I live in Harrogate, so I can't really. so actually, if Harrogate is the feudally lukewarm small town, then maybe actually there's a place for both, or somewhere between, or you have an existence like mine, which is you get to go between, and one acts as the refuge from the other, which I think is a really key point, which is about choice, not being dictated to. That you as a participant in places, you have choice, and therefore you're not designing places for everyone all of the time. People can come and go as they please. So, you know, what we're looking at is how we can appropriate spaces, how we can kind of take hold of them and make use of them, and how we can empower other people to then take control of their environment and become active participants within that, to encourage opportunistic behaviour. So, and in that sense, one of our tactics is to kind of subvert, is to look at guidelines and buildings and what they're used for, and think about ways in which we might subvert those rules. And a paper that I've written with Brett is on urban subversion and mobile cinema. And this ties in with some teaching that I teach the final 2 years masters at Sheffield University on architecture. And so we take those strategies and we use them with in our teaching. And actually what we were looking at there was kind of exploring tactics where students might actually engage with the kind of the city context and literally project future scenarios over identified sites for reuse, and projecting architectural designs of communal spaces and centralized civic leisure spaces to kind of counter the consumer-driven model, and identifying areas where this is all in Coventry. And we were doing this in the run-up to the UK City of Culture. And actually, most people in Coventry don't know that there's a river actually underneath the whole of the city centre. So we used this tactic of actually identifying buildings that were built over the river and proposing, identifying buildings that we wanted to then be removed to bring back some of that kind of heritage landscape that used to be there, and that reinforce the old historic model of the town that had been obliterated. So kind of literally sort of projecting on areas for subtraction, and actually creating a sort of a new narrative for that place, of kind of where there could be distinct urban design possibilities, where we're amplifying a new public domain. And actually sort of by subtracting areas and creating new areas of public land, we were then proposing that you would put that space back by intensifying the activities around it. And it's this kind of creation of these sort of alternative narratives. So actually, I think we are here. I think. So that's going off into the shopping area. So this is Museum Gardens. So actually, I'm trying to think, this would have been 2012. We won the competition to come up with some ideas for the lighting festival for York. And actually we presented a narrative for the lighting festival to say, change the concept of the lighting festival away from being this voyeurism of everyone standing in audience to look at buildings being lit up, and change it into a territory and create an alternative narrative for that territory. So now I've got to think about this to get this right. We basically proposed that the Earl of March, I think it's the Earl of March, owns Museum Gardens, and that Jim Moir, Vic Reeves and Bob Mortimer. Bob Mortimer is actually related to the Earl of March, and we put in our competition bid that Bob Mortimer inherited Museum Gardens, and with Vic Reeves wanted to turn it into Wonderland. And so we overlaid this kind of narrative of Alice in Wonderland and lit. So we had the kind of buy, eat, drink, and things would make you big and small. And we played with scale of lit objects across the gardens to create a new narrative landscape, but also then to open up the gardens at times that when so actually what we ended up doing we won the competition, we ended up working with Vic Reeves, who did the standard kind of projection onto the buildings. But what we were really keen on was the legacy of this being about opening the gardens up at night and actually trying to open up other spaces through the gardens. So actually York had we're in partnership with Blackpool. They've got some sort of partnership going. So we borrowed all of the lights from Blackpool. We just had to go over and get them. So there was a drive over in a transit van to go through Blackpool's store, and then we could have whatever we wanted. And they didn't want them back. So the proposal was that the lights were going to stay in all of the trees. And that would mean that the surface car park on one side of the museum gardens would then be able to connect in the evening during the winter months to the shopping centre, the town centre shopping areas when it got late night opening. And nobody seemed to remember this bit, so I still have 2 kilometres of festoon lighting in a crate in the office. But actually, even though we weren't directly successful, I think we were quite successful in other ideas were then established, and other parts of the gardens have been opened up and reworked off of the back of doing this. And I think it's that thing about kind of changing people's perspectives about how they use places. So in a kind of similar vein, another pop-up project that we did was to was actually part of a kind of political statement about stalk development in Leeds, and how many spaces around heritage assets had got consent for planning consent for new buildings, but they weren't developing them, and they were, in order to get revenue from the spaces, we're using them for car parks and surface car parking. And so we made a point of actually how you could make better use of these spaces, or you could add other uses in, and we held a pop-up cinema in one of those spaces. And actually that led to us then writing an interim car parking policy document for the town council in order to legitimise a number of these illegal car parking spaces with kind of 5 criteria, and the key ones were new public routes, public open space, and if you provided those, then there were a number of things, but it kind of informed partly how the city was developing. So we're kind of carrying on that kind of vein of looking at using kind of meanwhile uses and pop-up uses to sort of shift people's perspective and actually take that as an active strategy when looking at other places. So this is actually Hartlepool, And you've got sort of, I don't know, you've got the main kind of civic quarter and the shopping centre over here. And then this was the sort of Church Street was the kind of the nicest street in Hartlepool. It's kind of slightly down at heel. And they're doing a big sort of landscape urban round project in there. And then we had a sort of whole series of kind of pop-up activities to sort of reanimate that street, and then linked to another building that we were then asked to look at, which is the Grade 2 listed former post office building, which was, I mean, it gives you an indication of the nature of the place. You know, where this is an abandoned forecourt of a garage that's now being used as a car wash, with an advert to the McDonald's that's out of town, with the Grade 2 listed post office building only being used at the ground floor for Zeus, and then completely abandoned above. And we were asked to kind of look at this as a catalyst project on graduate capture, and basically to set up kind of new workspaces for graduates coming into this building, and to try and sort of get them to stay in the town. So there's a new extension across the back, but by kind of adding the extension across the back, and this is on site, we created a kind of a courtyard in the middle. But actually, what this has become has been a conversation with the old building, the new building, and this kind of duality of these two wings and how they talk to each other. And what we've looked at is kind of how we've consciously manipulated the budget for repair to kind of make the spaces appropriate to their new but not permanent end user, and not wanting to create a clean shell. I think we're conscious that kind of normally architecture kind of edits out this bit of mess, and it creates this kind of hermetically sealed clean box. It's all kind of archetypally white and clean with timber floors, and actually we wanted to keep a bit of the kind of the mess and sort of keep a bit unresolved, a little bit less resolved, so that it didn't become a kind of single unified whole. But there was this pattern of kind of use from previous occupants and new occupants, and then also an openness that it could then be changed as well in the future. And in that sense, we were kind of consciously kind of referring to Keller Easterling and the idea of kind of, you know, what you edit, what you choose to edit out, what you're subtracting or what you're adding, and it's becoming a kind of conscious dialogue, which clearly then, the interesting thing about that is, what do you choose to keep and what do you choose to leave behind, and who determines who's right? And the answer is that no one's right. It's a taste thing. It's whoever's doing it with you, and it's that team's response. So this is Zeus, and actually none of this is staying. This is all going. I think we're keeping some elements of this, but it's gone. That wasn't of use to our new user, and we took a judgment call to kind of in our kind of editorial or curatorial approach, kind of similar to collage, of what we were keeping and what we weren't keeping. And we've chosen not to keep some of that. Quite a nice photograph. But in that way, what we're playing with is this idea of collage in architecture, and also a kind of key idea of Joshua Komaroff and Ongesher of an exquisite corpse, that actually not seeking this kind of perfect singular utopian view, but actually enjoying the mess, enjoying things when they don't quite work, and almost celebrating the idiosyncrasy that comes, in order to sort of try and define something that then becomes distinct to that place and distinct to its users. So kind of the exquisite corpse was a kind of type of horror in architecture, where the problem of singularity, the death of the unified building, is expressed. It's characterized by unmediated adjacencies. Varied parts are casually placed side by side at their meetings, which creates this kind of magical compositional language of collage. So that kind of visible coherence kind of there's total freedom to be whatever you want it to be within that. And that kind of we were asked to look at a project in Whitby, and straight away the excitement of Whitby was that it's home to the biggest Gothic festival in Britain, and is a kind of mecca for characters. And actually, what we hadn't realised until we'd done a little bit of research is that Gothic is actually a reaction to the rationalised. I think it's kind of reference to kind of classicism, that Gothic was a reaction to that. But I suspect you'll know more of that than me. But actually, it's, you walk around Whitby and there are these kind of unexpected cultural kind of manifestations. So we were asked to design a public toilet for Whitby. And we said, well, okay, but we'll only do it on the basis that you entertain us, and we'll do it. If you like what we do, we'll carry on, and if you don't, you can go off and you can get somebody else, and then they can do it. And so what we did was we said, right, well, okay, we'll give you the toilet, and we kind of gave them the toilet as a plinth, and then we said, well, we're going to put a really big roof on top of the toilet, and the roof is then a loft, and the loft has no use, and that if it has no use, then it can be misused. It has no program. It can be potentially anything that you want it to be. And so the site that we'd been given was on the back of a surface car park. And you'll see there's points where lots of projects sort of start to kind of overlap each other. And having done the kind of the pop-up cinema, we were like, well, why don't we set something up so that the loft could then become a big screen, and people could actually kind of, we could take over and make use of the surface car park so that it becomes a pop-up screen, and the pop-up cinema and an event space. It could tie into a kind of program of events like we were talking about we'd proven was kind of working at Scarborough. Because this was a harbour facilities building, we could do this without getting planning permission, because we could go through permitted development rights because it was a facilities building, and we wouldn't have to provide disabled access because actually we weren't supposed to be using the roof. So we were actively looking to kind of play games with the kind of the legislation to allow us to do things that if we'd have asked permission for, we wouldn't have got. So it's kind of actively engaging in how we could misuse this. And we sold it to the council on the basis that as part of their Gothic festival, that would mean they could come and they could invite bands to play on the toilet. And for those, there are a couple of people in the room that are probably old enough to remember Captain Sensible and the Damned, but this was the Damned on the toilet, and Captain Sensible used to play on stage, sat on a toilet. So the council went for it. But obviously we presented this idea of a free room, but a free room doesn't come for free. It comes at a cost. So whilst there's an element of kind of humour, actually we're quite serious about then engaging with, well, it's going to cost you 30% more money than just delivering the toilets, but what else can you get back from that? And engaging with them in kind of where revenue income could come from and where their responsibilities would lie, and how that would work. So I think in planning terms, it would be considered sui generis use. So it wouldn't fall into any particular use. So yeah, I mean, you get the general idea. So I think, broadly speaking, I think what we do, or what we try to do, probably comes down to a kind of level of kind of direct urbanism, where we're kind of sort of tactically looking at interventions and strategic thinking as kind of ways of kind of participating in place. And that sort of, I think we're always looking at how we might stimulate place and concentrate on kind of the conditions for activity and event. So in a way, kind of Schumi was kind of fascinated by the ability of the metropolis to generate unexpected social, cultural manifestations. That's what we like, is when we're surprised by the way things kind of take place. And so we're kind of interested in how, as Schumi was, you can sort of design spaces that support and encourage and facilitate activity, where we're kind of foregrounding that activity and backgrounding the architecture. So it's always about celebrating the user. Now, very much in that way, that means that quite often we like to think that we're active rather than being passive, that we're not sat around like private detectives waiting for a commission to walk in the door, but that we're actually going out. And sometimes it's not that we're going out to find a project, it's that a project does come our way, but we then amplify what we might be able to do with that and pose difficult questions back to clients, or highlight the opportunity of, have you thought of this? And we could just spill out and make use of that and start to just sort of either farm the commission or have a bit of brief creep and sort of just expand the brief and try and take in more than which actually puts quite a few clients off. Actually, we get, no, thank you, it's too much, go away, stay in your box and do what we've been asked to do. And we've turned some projects down, not because we don't want to do the project, but because actually the clients aren't interested in engaging in a dialogue to expand and explore what that brief might be. So we were approached by a client who did actually want to engage in what a project might be, and that they didn't really have any ideas of their own. And that there was an identified need, there was a kind of problem where the conventional development economics didn't work. So there were a series in Leeds, a series of back-to-back houses. And with the back-to-back houses, they didn't used to have any plumbing inside them. So the wash areas would have, every row of 12 back-to-back, 24 houses, there was a gap, and that's where your toilets and your washing facilities were. With a kind of privatisation of that model, all the plumbing and kind of privatisation of people's sort of washing and cleaning habits, it's all been moved inside, and those communal spaces and those neighbourhood spaces have become have been internalised into the houses. And so actually what we looked at is that, well, how could we introduce a kind of new neighbourhood utility, something that could then come in and make use of those gap spaces, but bring back that historic relevance as to why those gaps were there. And so in a way, actually just sort of revisit and get back to the original model of how that neighbourhood was supposed to work with these intermediate communal spaces, and reintroduce that as a benefit to the area. And we did a paper on that and introduced, which we spoke at UAE conference, kind of politics of space and health, and then we held a symposium in Leeds with kind of Kate from the office talking about the new neighbourhood utility, but looking at that in the context of kind of public health across the city, and how local authorities, councillors, developers could all be engaging the ideas of kind of wasted space, or space that doesn't meet the kind of current economic model, how they could be used or subverted or reused in a different way. So, really, I suppose what we're about is, we like smoking, we like photography, we like ball games. I like drinking a lot. My son likes skateboarding. I quite like graffiti. I definitely like music, and then I'm struggling to no snogging. I like snogging and loitering, and I really quite like picnics. So, actually we're slightly against this idea of kind of private property, and we want to make property accessible to do all of these things. So when we were invited to do a project for an institution, we were a little nervous that we might be met by this kind of bureaucratic kind of control, an over control of space. And but actually, we ended up engaging with David Warren, the kind of director at College of Music. And it actually all became about a conversation about what his business objectives were, which was all about actually opening up the college and actually taking down those boundaries of an institution and opening it up to a broader public. So this is our site. It's kind of the roof area here. There's a 300-seat auditorium here. And at the moment, there was only space for 20 people outside of the auditorium. So we were to create a kind of new foyer area for that. So our project was this kind of new extension onto the top, which actually all became about how kind of people use that and bringing different people in and becoming a kind of public conservatory with views out above the city. So you've got kind of students and old people and all sorts of different people then engaging in pop-up performances in that space and conferencing.
I think it was very much part of the design process was that we wanted a space which would suit a wide range of our customers. And a space that had the flexibility to accommodate all kinds of different activities. But I think it's also something which we've built into the whole estate over the last couple of years with the design-led approach to the architecture that we're commissioning. That we don't feel like a college. And I think that's really, really important. The word college is in the name, but actually our spaces are something much more special. They respond to the boutique artistic practice which takes place right across the estate. So to have a bar space like this, which opens that up to the public, so they can see the same quality that's in our studios, the same quality that's in those spaces which are very private to the students, and to extend that forward into our front of house so that the public, when they do come in, they can experience a very, very special place of learning, but also a place of art in the city.
So actually, we steal. So actually, this is part homage to Koolhaas and the Kunsthalle in Rotterdam, where it's a big glazed lecture theatre. And the way they close it off for lectures is put a big curtain around it. So that's where the curtain came from. We don't mind stealing and borrowing. We're just quite honest about it when we do it. But that project led on to then the redoing a little public space outside. And earlier in the year, I'd done a walk around the city with an artist called Stephen Hodgson. And the walk I did was from zombie places to potent places and dormant spaces. And actually the zombie spaces were those kind of award-winning spaces in the city centre that were outside new office buildings, where actually if you sat down to have a picnic on the grass, then you were asked to move within 5 minutes by the security guard from one of the spaces around. So when we were asked to actually start to look at the space outside the BBC, which is kind of just at the bottom of that Leeds College of Music, we were like, well, we can't do one of those spaces. It's got to be a space where people can play and have fun. And so when we initially did the scheme, we had wobbly stages, and we weren't allowed to do the wobbly stages for health and safety. But we managed to keep it so that if you stand on the stage, then a spotlight comes on and there's a PA amp next to it, and you can plug in so you can perform in that space. We still haven't managed to get it, but we've got a call out to the client to have the the Abbey Road photograph done, or so we made sort of little puns and jokes. And so actually these aren't seats, they're just logs, but it means you can jump on them. If we put said they were seats, then we'd have to provide some paper bins. So they're not seats, they're just sticks. That means we don't have to put paper bins in the way, and it's just sort of playing little games and trying to have some kind of fun with these things. And actually, this has become a really popular place for people. Actually, the council have put some bins there because it's so popular for people to eat sandwiches. But it's great; it gets used, and there's kind of bars over the road, and they come and use it. So we're quite happy about that. But I think for us, it's about trying to set up these kind of narratives or this kind of anticipatory kind of fiction that allows people to engage and see spaces in a different way. And sometimes that narrative comes from a kind of historical precedent, or it'll come from the environment that we're working in. But we're trying to find that narrative in all of the projects, and feel that narrative is really important if the spaces and the places are then to be adopted by the users and to feel comfortable. So this is a bird hide for Yorkshire Water up in Driftfield, and it's a reservoir. So it's not, but then they've built up a nature reserve around it. This was the approach to the kind of key visitor bird hide previously, which wasn't at all engaging for visitors. It was very much just opportune about trying to get these views and catered really only for serious bird watchers. And this was about creating something that would be much more for the public. So we wanted to create a kind of a tree house. So the view that you saw before was looking across the water from the reservoir. So the kind of the traditional bird hide is the thing that kind of pops up directly in line with this kind of concrete datum. But that actually we could put a learning centre underneath it, and we could choose the building as a shield for people then approaching it at that level, which gave us an opportunity to kind of create a new space at the back. And so actually your approach is to come up this sloped wall to the building as a shield in front of the reservoir that's behind. But then in so doing, what we actually did was we excavated out the material to create the earth bunding and created this new lake. So we created this whole new landscape with a narrative about how people can use that space and engage in that space, and how the classroom, the water level's supposed to be up here, gets there eventually. But the idea then that this classroom, it becomes really detracted. You can't look at the blackboard to be taught because you're looking out of the window at the spaces and the activity that's going on. So engaging with young people, but also then engaging with the traditional bird watcher in their space as well. So we're sort of editing and curating that story as we move through. So I think what we're always looking for is this kind of opportunity for people to feel at home, and for there to be a familiarity, but equally that homeliness or unhomeliness to be the element of surprise. You're so comfortable that there can be an element of surprise, but that you take it into your own, and therefore you can kind of manipulate it and turn it into the thing that you want. So actually this is one of our kind of favorite projects. It's probably one of our smaller projects where it was all about the client's enthusiasm. Three young guys wanted to set up a bar, and we gave them a concept of a townhouse with the ground floor garden shed, the man cave, the first floor kitchen, and the top floor as the gig space. And it's a really popular space, but it's popular because they've made it their own, and they've just filled it with stuff, and it's their space, not our space. And this is a successful project. It's not about architecture; it's about people enjoying themselves and enjoying themselves, just being there and doing what they want to do. It's kind of fit for purpose. So, two key themes to us are this, trying to identify the uncanny and really enjoying the erotic, trying to identify kind of Marion Young's kind of, literally, sort of, where one can encounter the unfamiliar and the strange and take pleasure from it, and to seek to try and amplify the opportunities for that to happen. So kind of projects that we're starting to look at, which have great potential for that, are Cleethorpes, a new master plan for Cleethorpes. And again, this is about, it's an aerial view, but wouldn't it be great if Cleethorpes was like this again? And actually, you read the stories about kind of Victorian seaside towns as places on the edge where classes could mix, the unexpected was allowed to happen, you could get drunk, it's a kind of slightly permissive society. That's what we want to try and bring back. Now, obviously, we have to kind of try and tailor that conversation when we're talking to the authorities in Cleethorpes. But the idea of kind of social mixing and vibrancy and the latent potential and opportunity for combinations of kind of happen, and just looking at how we might organise the infrastructure to enable those things to happen, that's our approach with the kind of master plan. And in a similar way, we're looking at another project now in West Brom for a new market, and actually what we're looking at is bringing a theatre actually into the plan, so that we can, when the market hall gets vacated after kind of 5:30, the theatre can start to take over. So actually starting to look where we get the opportunities on newer builds as to how we can kind of bring in this kind of complexity. So we're always looking for kind of complexity and hybrid forms and densifying and amplifying the experience to create a more intense atmosphere. And these are common themes throughout all of that. That also spells chaddy, which is slang for underwear in India, which means we don't forget it. But yeah, so kind of, I said I'd come back to ginger groups. A ginger group is a political term. So kind of prior to there being a white paper written by the government will kind of task a group to come up with alternative ideas for the benefit of the host, and those groups are called ginger groups. So we are a ginger group, or group ginger. So that's what we like to try and do, is basically identify a client's need and then kind of amplify the potential and celebrate the activity that project could bring. So, questions? I wasn't interrupted.
Thank you, Simon. Sorry, I was waiting for this guy to say something. Really nice person, unfortunately.
It just keeps going like that all night.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you. Really interesting set of case studies as well. So, questions or comments on what you've just experienced? Yes, Dom.
I'll start off. It seems to be a very common thread running through a lot of your projects there, which is about theatre.
Yes.
And about the fact of using space either as theatre, where the people coming to the space are the audience coming into the theatrical space, or they're the actors on stage in some way. And I find that really interesting about why you've thought of theatre as the big metaphor for building, for architecture.
Because I don't think it's what a lot of architects do.
Yeah.
I think most architects, we talk about it as it's about not objectifying architecture, but actually seeing it as a backdrop to the activity. And what's important is how people use those spaces. And actually, if they're the most important, then they should be the thing that's celebrated. And there's a bit more freedom then that comes if you start to think of it in theatrical ways.
I suppose there's two things that occur to me. There's theatre is spectacle. So there's something about the visual, the visuality of space. But theatre is also about the programme changes regularly.
Well, I think
change
it
is
actually,
built into theatre,
but
isn't it?
in order for the programme to change, it's about management.
Yes.
And that means there has to be an active role of people that are managing and organising those spaces and recognising that that's a responsibility, that it's not all solved by architecture. You know, and you look at lots of failed projects and the architect is held up to be accountable, but actually most of the failings come from poor management of those spaces. So I think that's the benefit when you start to look at these projects as kind of theatre and talk about the animation of the space is the active role of the client to then take responsibility for the management and ongoing management of that
Is
space.
that regular changing of the theatrical programme, as it were, is that what stops them becoming zombie spaces? That the zombie space is something which is fixed and never changes?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure because I think. You see, I still think you can overmanage and you can prescribe, and actually that would then still become a zombie space. For it to not be zombie space means it's got to be a permissive space where you're slightly more liberal and relaxed about people are allowed to do there. And I think, you know, really the guide for that is if it's not doing anyone any harm, then let them do it. Would be, you know, I mean, I think, you know, there are some fantastic spaces. Some of the ones that we love. There's, do you know Emshler Park in Essen? It's now listed as I think it's one of the 7 industrial wonders of the world. It's been turned into a national park in Germany, and it's an old blast furnace. The relic of the blast furnace is still there, but if you look on the Alpine climbing network, it's also listed on the Alpine climbing network as the lowest altitude place as part of its network. But the only reason it's done that is so that the blast furnace is now registered as a landscape and you are freely allowed to climb and walk all over it. But if you fall off it and kill yourself, it's no one's fault but your own because it's a landscape. So it's that's what we like, you know, is that we can do anything you want.
Yeah.
So,
That's cool.
Yes, Claire.
Hi, thanks. So I got a sense from your talk that you have a strong concept of what you want to do in the projects, and you mentioned with the Scarborough Market having like consultation and conversation with the people who use the market. I was wondering how strong those conversations and participatory roles are for your kind of public projects.
in terms of, well, yes, they vary. I mean, we did lots of consultation on Scarborough Market. Each time we turned up for consultation, we were warned about were we ready for World War III. And actually, World War III never broke out. But usually that fear is because they're afraid that you're going to tell them you're going to present to them their worst fear. But actually, when you engage with people and there's a logic to what you're doing, then it's fine. You know, usually it's fine. But it wasn't a participatory, inclusive design exercise with the traders. They were consulted on a plan, and information was shared with them so they could input to it. But it wasn't a design charrette where they were active participants. I think that's a very different type of exercise. We are looking at a project in Grimsby in the Casbah where the British Ports Authority are looking for ideas as to what to do with that space. And there we're designing a facilitation tool where it's an open-ended model. I mean, literally, we're making a big model of the area as a giant table for people to come and put their ideas on and solicit ideas. So that's there's two, I think, very distinct types of consultation event, and both have their place. So no, we don't. It's not always a kind of participatory, charrette, inclusive design opportunity. There's an openness and a sharing of the ideas. There's a transparency, but not necessarily a. I think that's the other thing about maybe it being theatre, that we're quite clear when we've got curatorial and editorial control. It's not a over to you. That comes, you can freely do what you want with it after.
I'd just like to, can I just
Yes,
follow
Jill.
up with supplement to that? Because I was going to ask a similar question, really. So much at the heart of what you're talking about is places where people can be active, and you talk about users, residents, shoppers, people in their different roles, multiple roles in their everyday life. So how do you get the sense, if you don't do that kind of participative, talking kind of inclusive event, how do you get the sense of what is going to work for the people that your project's going to serve?
Well, we do it when we think it's relevant. Quite often, it's clients that don't want to do it rather than ourselves. In the case of Scarborough Market, where we gave them the event space, it was a try it. It was a try it and see. Actually, I think if we'd have consulted with too many people about that, it wouldn't have happened. And I think that's the fine line. You ask too many people and actually nothing will happen. So sometimes it's actually setting it up, minimizing the risk. What's the worst that could happen? They end up putting more stalls in and they don't have events there. But actually what happened was the events have become really successful, and we're now being able to build on that for another project and use that as a case study, and that local authority to tell another local authority that this could be a good thing. I suppose similar with the toilet in Whitby. Will it work? Won't it work? No, don't know. We think it'll work, but again, I think if we were to consult too many people about it, then people don't like the open-ended nature of it, and they'd want to close it down and have all the certainty about what it is.
I'm thinking about it in a consultative way. I'm thinking about just how do you get a sense of the people who might be using that space and what the kind of appetite is for the kind of liminal sort of exciting, slightly dangerous, but also recognisably homely things that you do. That must mean you have some sense of the people that you're working for when you do design. I'm just wondering how you gain that sense, just by being there.
We go a lot, but then actually I think we design spaces that we would like to be in as well. And we try and have a pretty good mix in the office and talk. So I suppose it's not me sat in a room on my own thinking of it. There's a wider team, and there's an ongoing conversation, and everybody's inputting that, and we engage the clients with that process as well. And then I think we design spaces that we would want to use and make use of. But then so much of it comes down to then handing that over as a canvas to somebody else to make use of and run with. So in the case with the bar's successful because the boys have taken it on and made it their own and invited all of their friends and other friends along. And it's what they've done that's made it a success, not what we did. We just gave them the infrastructure to enable that to happen. And I think that's quite an interesting point. It's where does the architecture end? And when does it where does the responsibility? See, I don't think the architecture does end. I think you just hand over a level of responsibility for it. I mean, where we are now is an active, dynamic space, but it was designed hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and the architect's long since dead. But actually, the success of this place comes over to those that are curating and managing it now. Does that sort of answer the?
Yeah, thank you.
Brianna.
I was just wondering, specifically like in the example of the bringing the public to a model and stuff and having them put their ideas in the model, do you find that you ever have a backlash, considering you also retain managerial control?
We haven't had a backlash on anything, but then I think you can't please everyone, and I think it's a personal view that I think if you try, you'll end up producing something pretty bland and mediocre. So actually, don't worry about it. You know, and I think that was kind of my point about the kind of feudally lukewarm Harrogate versus a kind of metropolis and everywhere in between. It's about choice and giving people choice. And if some people don't like it, it's fine. There's plenty of other places they can go and they can engage. So it's about being authentic with what that is and distinct.
Do you think that there's a difference in that between if it's a large, like metropolitan area, or if it's a more small rural area?
In what way?
Like, in my experience and stuff, like small rural areas tend to be, you know, like very close-knit communities, and they like are very passionate about like their areas, their landscapes and stuff. So if you come in and you say, you know, like bring your ideas and stuff, like let's do this collaboratively, but if you like you say, but we also maintain, you know, certain
Well, we never
control.
tell anyone that we maintain
Oh, okay.
curatorial control. I mean, that's the conceit, isn't it? You know, the trick is to go through a process where at the end of the process, other people present your ideas as their own. So actually, you know, the best thing ever was actually turning up to a local authority meeting to talk about the toilet in Whitby, where I had a councillor tell me my joke of the damned playing on the toilet. And it's like, brilliant. Yeah, that's right. So, you know, that's, you know, so that it's not a game, it's really serious, but the objective is to work with people so that they adopt and take on board the ideas and then are so impassioned about it that they present them as their own. They become champions for the scheme. If you know, I suppose in a way it relates back to your question. If through that design process you can't find those champions to celebrate the design process for themselves, then you know it's not right, and you stop and you go on a different tack until you find the champion that can. So I think really we're always looking for the champion. We're looking for somebody else to take it on that's then gets it enough that they're going to become its custodian when we're off doing another project. Because none of them work if they don't have a champion.
I'd like to get a sense of what your practice is actually like. So how many people work for Group Ginger, and what sort of people?
It goes up and down.
Okay.
We're
What's it like now?
We're quite small. There's 6 of us
Okay.
at the moment. 7 if there's a student in as well.
Yeah.
We try and have we have a good gender mix. We're about 60-40 at the moment, but you know, one movement makes a big percentage swing when you're only quite small. But it's relatively young.
Mm.
I'm the eldest by at least 10 years. So we're actually put in. It was a bit of a joke in the office. They put us in for Young Architect of the Year award, and I couldn't turn up because I was too old. And we got shortlisted. So 2 of the guys went down for the office for the kind of the photo shoot, but I went on stage and took the award for someone else. But it was all right. But
so when you recruit, what do you? I mean, presumably you're looking for something very specific when you recruit new staff.
Enthusiasm, imagination, and a willingness to question. And that's questioned me as well. I mean, I think it goes back to your point. You know, the office doesn't work if I'm then helicoptering over everyone, telling them what to do. There's a sort of healthy level throughout all of this. There's a healthy level of disrespect. You know, it's kind of, we don't really respect heritage. I mean, we have a lot of conservation projects, but we're not heritage architects.
Yeah.
Yes, we have one person in the office that's going through the process of becoming recognised as a conservation architect, but that's just so that we can kind of put those accreditations on the website. Doesn't mean we're going to change the way that we approach it. There's a healthy dialogue, a lot of disrespect, healthy disrespect. It's fun. It is fun. Music's usually on. Hours can be late, but we do have some rules. What are the rules? We don't generally work weekends. Christmas parties generally are abroad, so that we try and go to places. So we're going to Dublin this year. We went to Barcelona last year. We were in Amsterdam the year before. And so we try and go to places and have a look at things so that we don't become conditioned by our surroundings. And it becomes much easier then to talk to clients and say, have you seen? So we're off to Marseille in 2 weeks. So we try and get out and look about. And when we can, we try and employ people from Europe as well. So to bring another kind of.
Yeah, it's really helpful just to get a picture, given what we've seen of your work.
Yeah,
it's
it's
really
not-
interesting to know what the.
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a reflection of how much work you've got. I mean, I'd like to have a couple more people and a bit more work and a little bit more freedom, but that that'll come hopefully.
Interesting, thank you. Other questions?
Come on, someone's got to pick me up on the
Who's going to ask the heritage question?
abusive heritage.
Okay, yes, Claire.
It's not really a question, but you say that, yet throughout your presentation, it kept coming, you kept going into the past and the future, through the present, jumping around. So whilst you say you're not conservation architects per se, I'd argue that you are inspired, informed
I think that's
from the
right.
past.
I think we generally, a lot of what we do is clean up the mess that other people have made. And most of the time, that's actually about stripping it back to find that the original intent and story that was inherent in the structure, and then making that evident to other people again and try and reinforce that. So, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek because I think we end up making quite bold moves, and on the surface I think they can be seen to be bold and intrusive, but usually it's because actually we're trying to sort of subtract the detritus of stuff that's kind of covering up or embellishing the gem that's hidden inside. So yeah, we are quite respectful, really. Yeah. We're just veiled.
Any other questions? Alison.
I actually wanted to ask, because there always seemed to be a thread going through of a bit of a kind of was moral give and take. So you want spaces to be used and you want them to be enjoyed. But in order to do that, sometimes for your design plan, it means not having disabled access or, not putting the bins right there so that, someone's going to have to come clear on the mess, and whether sometimes making it more user-friendly for the majority gives that level of kind of social or physical exclusion to other people who might want to use them.
I think it's a similar question in a way to the heritage one. I think we are slightly provocative. I'm slightly provocative in terms of the way that I present it. But I think it's about trying to recognise things when they become a true constraint or when they're not. And what's the overriding objective? And if something's getting in the way of delivering that objective, is there a way in which we can kind of sideline it and get around it? Because I think, we don't please everybody all of the time, but that means we do get things delivered. But I think we're very serious about what we do and our responsibility, and we joke a little bit about not sleeping at night. So on Scarborough Market, the steelwork was so big that the engineer clearly had a really good night's sleep because this thing wasn't going to move anywhere. And so when we came to do the Leeds College of Music, we took the engineer out for a drink and we said, right, we're convinced that engineers sleep too well. And we want you to trim down the steel work to such a point that you're waking up in the morning to think, well, have I put enough meat on the steel? Is it going to stand up or not? So we can have the thinnest columns as possible. So it's tongue in cheek. We're very serious about the responsibility, but it's just pushing everybody along and trying to just push it all a bit to try and get it to be better. So, but yeah, I mean, actually the bin thing's really annoying because actually I hate the bins that they've put in, and now I think we should have bloody put the bins in because then there'd be bins that we'd like. But you learn. So.
Obviously, you did the thing in Museum Gardens, which I remember. But have you done anything else in York? Have you worked in York? Other than that?
No.
Is that just because York is York, and maybe the kind of ideas that you?
No, we were invited 2 weeks ago, actually, in by the council to go and talk about 7 plots of land that they've got for some housing, which they're going out to tender on. Which is really exciting. They're going to deliver them themselves so that they can inform them on. I don't think we'll be able to tender because all tenders go on the same basis of show us what you've done before. So, we haven't done enough to be able to demonstrate that. But so it's not because we wouldn't want to. It's just waiting for not waiting for an opportunity, but there being an opportunity that we can go.
And the same for Harrogate. So
we are looking at
these are places of
no, we are looking at Harrogate. So actually, in the same vein of Cleethorpes, there's we've been doing a number of bits of work for the conference arena in Harrogate and then Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. We're actually looking at. And I think maybe it comes down because there's a bit of a focus on leisure and how people use spaces and public spaces and an urban design approach. We've actually been engaged to look at how a future strategy development plan for Harrogate Conference Centre. And then similar with Royal Armouries Museum, it's actually how they can make it a better museum and consolidate their estate, look at how they move their assets around and how they can future-proof the museum, which is very similar in Harrogate. But we don't really get invited to do sort of little housing schemes in Harrogate, and they don't. And we get invited. We don't actively pursue private residential work, and every private residential job that's come into the office we've lost. Not because we've necessarily done anything wrong, I don't think, but we're not sort of set. That's not our kind of prime. It's not our core focus. So we will do them, but it takes a very particular type of client, I think, to want to come and use us for that. Yeah. So we're kind of suited to the messy, glittering, urban metropolis type stuff. So markets have become a real thing.
Right.
So,
Any final questions then before we finish? I need to know where the Brunswick is. That's just sort of one answer, one word.
Along from the Reliance.
Where's that? I don't know where that is.
Top of Leeds.
Oh, okay.
North of Leeds.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Simon, thank you very much. You said that this might be provocative for a heritage audience, and it certainly was, and that's great because that's just what we like. And you said a lot of things that we're going to go away and think about.
But I'm really glad that the person picked up that whilst I say it is, it's not really.
You give us some great material to think about and work with as well. So thank you. Thank you, Simon. So we'll now head to the Eagle and Child for a drink. Anyone who wants to join us, you're very welcome. And Simon's not going to be staying for dinner, but going to try and have a quick drink and then head off back to Harrogate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Feudally lukewarm. For a good night's sleep.
Yeah. Everything work all right?
Yeah.
Great.
No Wi-Fi connection.